Index Astartes, 1,000 Sons, heirs to the Ashen Dreams. In the Imperium, to be a son of Magnus is to stand forever apart of the rest of mankind, isolated from even their Astartes cousins. As some of the most powerful psychers serving the Emperor, the 1,000 Sons bear a heavy burden, their numbers forever kept low by the very source of their power. They are scattered across the galaxy, fighting in an endless war at the sides of armies that look upon them with fear and distrust. Dark visions of their lost homeworld, brought to ruin 10,000 years ago by the savages of the 6th Legion, haunt them to this day. They are melancholic lords of war, who have witnessed the slow fall of the Imperium, century after century, into superstition and ignorance. Their Primarch lost to them, they are left with no clear purpose in the galaxy, save for the protection of an Imperium that grows more hateful towards them with each passing decade. Now, they are only pushed forward by their duty to the Emperor, their father and mankind, and the distant, shrouded hope of a better future. Origins. Humans fear what they don't understand, and they hate and they hate what they fear. This simple fact has held truth from the dark ages of old Earth to this day, and it was it that led to the colonization of Prospero, and the twilight days of the first galactic human empire. At first glance, there was nothing on Prospero that could draw a human population. The planet was one gigantic desert, far from any major warp roads crossways. Yet these bleak features were precisely what led the first colonists to sail for the planet of dust. As the dark age of technology drew to a close, the psychic potential of mankind began to awake. Psychers and mutants started to appear, and with the collapse of the Eldar Empire beginning, their apparition heralded warp storms and other disasters. These strange individuals, wielding unknown powers, were soon perceived as those responsible and persecuted across the width and breadth of the galaxy. On countless thousands of worlds, vast pogroms were organized to purge the human population of any genetic deviancy. Though history would vindicate these massacres when the Age of Strife erupted and feral psychers enslaved entire worlds, untold billions of innocents were slain in the process. Yet not all psychers were willing to let themselves be slaughtered, nor were they ready to turn against the rest of humanity to protect themselves. Instead, they chose another path: exile. Using whatever ships they could obtain, the gifted of 1,000 worlds fled, seeking a place where they would be safe from persecution. A place where they could master and hone their talents until such a time as mankind was ready to welcome them back. Drawn to each other, the fleets of exiles finally settled in the dark reaches of the Ultima Segmentum. They named their world Prospero, in homage to an ancient legend from old Earth, and began to build their own civilization, hidden away from the rest of the galaxy. STC devices and careful use of their powers enabled them to live in an austere existence, appropriate to the research and meditation that were required to keep their psychic might under control. Pyramids and libraries were built within which each entire generations learned and discovered yet more knowledge. Yet even then, the exiles of Prospero did not know peace. From the deserts came the Psychinium, predators that fed on those psychically gifted by pulsing their eggs into their brains. What? How exactly such nightmarish creatures came to be is unknown. Certainly they weren't the product of natural evolution, for there was no way they could have sustained themselves prior to Prospero's colonization. Some claim that they were the result of the Psycher's presence influencing the local wildlife, while others are presumed that they were beings of the Imperium that had found a way to enter the Materium in order to feast on Prospero's population. Regardless of their origin, The Psychinium harassed the people of Prospero for centuries. Most of the time, they preyed only on lone wanderers, but sometimes they attacked one of the planet's cities in immense swarms, breaching its lines of defenses and slaughtering its inhabitants. Still, the Prosperian civilization endured, though its endless struggle against the psychic predators kept it from developing further, until salvation came from the skies. In a strike of flame, a life pod crashed into the very center of the great plaza of Zika, Prospero's greatest city. At first, the inhabitants recoiled from the object, fearing that it was a sign that those that had forced their forebears to exile had found them. But when no further bombardment came, they dared to approach the object, and were met by an infant floating in the air, psychic power crackling around him. His skin and hair were both red, and he looked at the world around him with two wide, curious eyes. Had the child landed on any other human world, he would doubtlessly have had to fight for his life, as its inhabitants attempted to destroy him, taking him to be the spawn of the warp. But the Prosperian were used to physical alterations that often accompany psychic potential, and they welcomed the child into their society. Under the guidance of Ammon, the leader of Zika, and other teachers, Magnus quickly learned all that the exiles of Prospero had uncovered of the Empyrean. He mastered all the arts, as the wielding of the warp's power was known to them. Soon rose to suppress all of his mentors. He studied the Prosperian philosophies and attended the lessons of many of Zika's scholars. Paralleling Magnus' intellectual growth was his physical transformation. His body went through stages of adolescence at an incredible speed, and barely a few years after his arrival, he was a giant of a man, towering above even those whose physical alterations manifested in thin, tall bodies. With a wild mane of crimson hair and a face that was at once handsome and full of wisdom, Magnus was a demigod among mortals. Through his genius and charisma, Magnus quickly rose to become the leader of Zika, despite his young age. His first act was to begin a campaign of extermination against the Psychinium and the other predators of Prospero, so that civilization could resume its advance, free from their threat. One by one, the prodigal son sought and destroyed the beast's nest, forcing them to flee deep into the deserts. Only when he confronted the Psychinium Prime, the oldest of all the Psychinium on Prospero, was Magnus finally faced with a challenge. Such was the might of the beast that despite all his knowledge, power, and experience, Magnus was wounded deeply in battle, losing one of his eyes to the creature's claw. The beast was an abomination, as much a creature of the aether as it was from the physical plane. It was a grotesque insect, several times the size of its foe, buzzing with the sound of wings that defied the laws of physics and evolution alike. It stared at Magnus with two enormous faceted eyes, and though its face was ugly as the rest of it, the young man couldn't help but feel that it was mocking him. The Psychinium Prime fed on Magnus's power, draining him of the might that had been his since the first time he had opened his eyes. Over and over again, he tried to destroy it, unleashing bolt of lightning after bolt of lightning. But all his attacks dissipated harmlessly, long before they could reach their target. A clawed appendage burst into motion, faster than anything of the material plane had any right to move. Magnus barely managed to move his throat out of its way, but it came back down in a second assault. Despite his desperate dodge, the claw reached his face. It tore into the skin of his flesh, and cut right through his right eye. Magnus screamed as agony, unlike anything he had ever felt, spread through his body. The pain was only partially physical. The Psychinium Prime's attack had also caused damage to his very soul. Refusing to let the pain weaken him, Magnus focused once more on his foe, using his torment to fuel his rage and will to triumph. With a great roar, he jumped at the beast, clasping its wings with his bare hands and pushing it to the ground with his weight. Like a barbarian, he tore the wings from the creature's back before bringing his fists down upon his grotesque skull over and over again, until all that remained was a smear on the sand. Then, groggy from the pain and exertion, Magnus staggered away from his kill, beginning to walk back to Zika, bleeding from several wounds. All of them were already healing, except for the last one he had taken. This one, he knew he would carry for the rest of his days. But the loss of his eye had taught him a lesson he would not forget. His hand pressing on the gaping wound, Magnus vowed that he would remember that there were some things that couldn't be defeated by the power of the mind alone. Some foulness that needed to be banished with brawn and righteousness. While never managed to fully eradicate the scourge of Psychenium, Magnus' crusade reduced them to a mere nuisance. The other Prosperian cities rejoiced at the liberation, and Magnus became the leader of a coalition that spawned the entirety of the planet, receiving the title of Crimson King. Under his leadership, Prospero entered a golden age of discovery and culture, with arts both physical and ethereal reaching new heights. When the Emperor reached Prospero, Magnus was expecting his father's arrival. The Primarch was unique among his brothers in that he alone remembered his entire existence from the moment the spark of life had first touched his infant body, and the master of mankind's gene laboratories. He remembered touching minds with the Emperor then, and the two had remained in distant psychic contact ever since. Magnus guiding his father to Prospero so that they could be reunited in body as well as in spirit. Though the people of Prospero feared the arrival of the Emperor at first, Magnus assuaged their fears, telling them that the Great Crusade was the very thing their ancestors had hoped mankind would accomplish. The time when they could return to their species, free of prejudice and hatred. He told them that he had spoken with his father many times before, and that they could trust into his wisdom, for he was the epitome of what Prosperian philosophers believed into, the greatest human psyker to have ever lived. Yet the reunion was not only a cause of joy, for the Emperor brought dire news to Magnus. News that he had believed it was too risky to exchange through the whimsical tides of the Imperium. The warriors created from Magnus' gene seed, the 15th Space Marine Legion, were dying out, afflicted by a terrible plague of mutation. The Flesh Change, as it became known, had emerged among the Legion's ranks shortly after the beginning of the Great Crusade, and its symptoms were appalling. At first, the psychic powers of the afflicted warriors increased drastically, and the alterations could be contained through the exercise of one's willpower. But sooner or later, the pressure became too much, and the mutations overwhelmed the legionary, reducing him to a whimpering, senseless beast that had to be put down. Already, thousands of Astartes had been lost, and the recruiting process had all but stopped as apothecaries refused to expose more souls to the flesh change. The Emperor's best savants and gene smiths were unable to stop it, and Magnus, with all the knowledge of Prospero, was the last hope of the 1,000 sons he had left. Fitting. The Great Crusade. The history of the 15th Legion, up to the emergence of their affliction, had been a glorious one. Like all legions, their first recruits had come from Terra, more specifically from the Achaemenian Empire, situated in the Middle East, in what had once been called the Persian Empire. It had been an alliance of powerful tribes, whose shared might had shielded them from the worst of the Age of Strife's depredations. When the Emperor rose on Terra, they had been among the first to join him. And for that, and because their gene pool was relatively untainted, they became the source of the first 15th Legion's aspirants. One of the first battles in which the 15th Legion took part was the Boeotian Pacification. For more than 150 years, the ruling monarchy of Boeotia, the Isolite, had dragged on their integration into the Imperium. Always the kings would find more excuses to delay the process, and for a long time the Emperor tolerated this. But as the unification of Terra drew near, the master of mankind's patience with Boethiah's monarchs ran out. After one last, final warning, which was only met with yet more excuses, the Emperor dispatched his army, led by the first contingency of the 15th Space Marine Legion. The resulting battle was as devastating on one side as one might imagine. Boethiah, whatever it's called, fell in 12 days, and it only took that long because the Space Marines took care to avoid inflicting unnecessary civilian casualties. With their mighty psychic powers, the legionnaires ripped apart fortresses and drove entire battalions mad before finally confronting the Israelite kings and putting an end to a bloodline that had endured for 1,000 years. After that, they had taken to the stars and quickly accumulated a tally of compliances, for they were both gifted diplomats, wearing the mantle of scholars and teachers with the human civilizations ready to join the Imperium, and the cloak of psychic warriors when they faced resistance or the horrors of old night. World after world had been claimed by the expeditionary fleets under the command of the 15th Legion, until the flesh change had begun. Then everything had gone wrong. Many Imperial forces had been decimated by mutated legionnaires, driven mad by their hideous transformations. In several cases, the survivors had been purged by other Space Marines, in the hopes of hiding what had happened. They had partially succeeded in that, for the Emperor himself had taken measures to keep the affliction of the 15 as secretive as possible. Still, rumors had spread among all forces of the Great Crusade and across the newly born Imperium. Distrust towards the 15th Legion was growing just as quickly as their numbers diminished. Many among the lords of the Imperium suggested that the 15th Legion should be expunged from all records, his surviving members slain before the flesh change caught them, and his Primarch bound to the Emperor's service in the shadow, after he was himself tested for the taint, of course. The wound Magnus had taken in fighting the Psychinium Prime had long healed, but the empty eye socket had been replaced by smooth skin, earning him the nickname of Cyclops by those who saw it as proof that he was tainted as well. That's a little bit weird, but okay. My son, legacy shall not be reduced to an empty pedestal beneath the roof of the hegemon. Magnus, Primarch of the 15th Legion. But Magnus was determined to not let his son's story come to such an ignoble end. He dedicated himself wholly to his task, spending several years buried in one avenue of research after another. His legionnaires who became afflicted with a curse put into stasis until he succeeded. He conferred with the surviving apothecaries and genesmiths and pored over documents made available to him by the Master of Mankind, describing how the Astartes had been created. The Crimson King attempted many cures, but all of them failed, doing little more than slowing the progress of degeneration. Finally, in one last desperate bid, Magnus created a great arcane circle in the greatest of Prospero's deserts, farthest from any city, and cast his mind into the ether, seeking a way to find his sons in his fathomless deeps. In its fathomless deeps. The words came from 1,000 voices, all with subtly different intonations, that gave them a different meaning. "You are mine," shrieked the false god. "You have always been and will always be mine. Only I have the power to save your sons. Obey me, and I shall grant you their salvation." "Lies," shouted Magnus, power cracking out all over his hulking frame as he stood, defying the power who claimed to hold fate in its hands. "You have nothing. You are nothing. Only lies and deceit. You have no power over me." The Crimson Giant froze as he screamed the last words, a great revelation drawing upon him. "You have no power over me," he repeated slowly, only now understanding the truth. "And I don't need your help. You have no power over anyone that they did not give to you. And I give you nothing. Begone and trouble me no more." "This is not over, Magnus," threatened the voice. There will be a reckoning for this. You cannot defy me, for I am the architect of fate." "You are nothing," replied Magnus, and he turned away from the one who had promised him the truths of the universe. "Nothing but the lies we tell to ourselves, and I choose the truth. I shall free my sons of your poison, no matter the cost to myself. But I'll never call upon you. Do you hear me, demon? Never." The image of the Primarch vanished as he returned to the world of flesh and matter, leaving the thousand-headed god alone in a web of fate, unmade by the rebellion of he who should have been its champion. For a timeless moment there was silence, as the minions of the god looked upon their master, fearful of his anger. Then dark laughter resonated through the warp, as the god of change delighted in this new development, and the opportunities it offered. "There will be a reckoning," the voice repeated, calmer this time. "Kairos, my oracle, attend me." No one outside of the 15 Legion's highest circle knew what he found there. But it worked. As Prospero trembled from the psychic feedback of the Crimson King's gambit, Magnus put an end to his son's degeneration. Whatever means he employed left him much weakened, according to Khalidus, a remembrancer who was attached himself to the Crimson King much before the remembrancers became an official part of the Great Crusade. Many theorize that the Primarch used his own considerable power to extend some kind of blessing upon all carrying his bloodline, warding off the mutagenic effects of their psychic powers. The events that followed the end of the Scouring and the loss of the Cyclops many decades later certainly point us towards that conclusion. What is known, however, is that during the journey through the Sea of Souls, Magnus learned of the existence and terrible threat of the Chaos Gods, though he didn't understand exactly the import of what he had seen immediately. At once, he went to the Emperor, telling his father of the 4 terrible powers he had witnessed, and the numberless legions under his command. Despite having just saved his sons from the abject degeneracy, Magnus was greatly agitated and on the verge of hysteria, as the horrors he had seen flashed endlessly in his mind. The Emperor, through a mix of psychic purification and fatherly reassurance, calmed his son's fears. He told Magnus that what he had seen in the warp was indeed a terrible threat, but one that had been known to him for a long time, and that he had taken measures against it. In time, the Emperor promised Magnus would be told what these measures were, and the true nature of the transdimensional enemy. But for now, the Crimson King had a great task to attend. There were sons who needed his help to rebuild their all but ruined legion. Magnus, who had spent his life so far as a scholar, a leader of men, and a researcher of the arcane, now needed to learn the arts of war. The Crimson King journeyed to Terra, where he spent several months alongside his brother Perturabo, who had been rediscovered by the Emperor while Magnus toiled to save his sons. The two of them bonded quickly and explored the ruins of old Earth side by side, reveling equally in the ancient discoveries they unearthed. However, their time together soon ran out, and both of them went on to take official command of their legions, each pleading to always stand at the other's side if they were needed. Magnus named his legion the 1,000 Sons, so that they will always remember how close to utter extinction they had come, and would ever struggle to avoid facing such a fate again. In return, they changed the legion's colors, painting their armor in red to honor their Primarch, and taking as their emblem the sun rune of Prospero. For just as night would always be followed by day, so had the sons of Magnus returned to glory once more. The 15th Legion returned to the Great Crusade, its Primarch leading it to new victories and conquests, with a new influx of recruits from Prospero. The numbers of the 1,000 Sons swelled, though they never quite reached those of the other legions. At Magnus's command, the legion was reorganized, with cults being installed as a way for the sons of the Crimson King to best learn how to master their power. The Thousand Sons Cults. When Magnus took command of the 15th Legion, he created the Legionary Cults, a system that would allow his sons to learn the arts in a controlled fashion, so that they would never lose control of their powers. Inspired by the teaching structure of Prospero, each of these cults specialized in one particular type of abilities, and almost every legionary belonged to one. Only those with too little psychic potential weren't part of the system. There were 5 cults in all. The Corvide focused on precognition, the Ataenius, on telepathy, the Pavoni on psychokinesis, the Pyri on pyrokinesis, and the Raptore on telekinesis. At the end of each cult was a Magister Templi, the Astartes best versed in the cult's secrets. Though the title held no official authority, those who carried it were always captains at the least, and granted them some seniority over those of the same rank. Now, with the Thousand Sons much diminished and scattered across the galaxy, the cults still exist as a classification of powers and schools of training, but there are no Magister Templi, hierarchies determined solely by one's knowledge of the arts. The cult's teachings eventually spread to the librarians of the other legions, which didn't frown upon the use of psychic powers, save for the 6th Legion, which had always had its own tradition of psychic users, though the Sons of Fenris claimed them to be something else entirely, and would never have allowed the 15th Maleficarium to taint it. Despite their low numbers, the Thousand Sons earned a tally of victories worthy of any legion. Few enemies in the galaxy could match the strength of the Legiones Astartes, and when combined with the psychic might that flooded through Magnus's gene line, almost none could ever hope to resist. The 15 legions shattered alien empires and human tyrants alike, combing Bolter and Blade with the secrets of the cult combining. On every human world they encountered, regardless of whether compliance was achieved through force of arms or diplomacy, the Thousand Sons sought all the knowledge that the civilization had managed to preserve through the old night. Not the technological lore, which would have put them at odds with the magos of the Mechanicum, but the wisdom of the lost ages, and the philosophical texts and historical memories. These documents were copied and sent to Prospero and other worlds of their circle of library worlds that came to be known as the Prosperian Domain. The Prosperian Domain. During the time of the Great Crusade, most legions had at least one planet under their direct control to serve as a recruiting grounds, training place for aspirants, or for 100 other reasons. In most cases, the homeworld of the legion's Primarch served as the core of that nearly independent empire, apart from a few obvious cases, such as the Imperial Fists. The Thousand Sons were never great enough in numbers to warrant a full sub-empire of their own, and instead dedicated the worlds under their protection to another purpose. The Prosperian Domain, as it came to be known, was composed of a dozen planets at its peak, half of which were library worlds dedicated solely to the storage and study of ancient knowledge. The Dominion was centered on Prospero, with each world being only a short distance from the Legion's homeworld. There, the entire lineages of librarians spent their entire existence cataloging the findings of their Astartes masters from across the galaxy. To the Imperium's intellectual elite, the right to peruse the archives gathered by the Thousand Sons was beyond priceless. Things have changed, of course, since the burning of Prospero. The Prosperian Domain still exists, but it is much reduced in size, and its worlds serve a much different purpose. Despite the salvation Magnus had brought them, the reputation of the Thousand Sons remained muddy throughout the Great Crusade. The marks of Old Night remained on many worlds, bringing with them tales of wild psychers and the horrors they had wrought. Even among the Primarchs, Magnus' status was ambivalent. Some, like Perturabo, Horus, and others, regarded him as a good strategist and a powerful warrior who could also be a diplomat when it was required. Others, first among whose wait, that's a weird one. Others, first among whose were Mortarion and Russ, disliked his reliance on psychic powers and the fact that his legion was mostly made of sons of Prospero, a world either of them would have put to the torch had they been the first to reach it. These tensions between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons reached a paroxysm during the Battle of Shriek. For several years, forces of the Word-Bearers had been engaged in battle against the Avenian Empire, a human civilization that had refused the offer to integrate into the Imperium. Lorgar's sons, unable to break the Avian Empire's hold over the Arc-Reach Secundus sector, called for an aid from their fellow legionnaires. Both Magnus and Russ answered the call, though if Lorgar had known that they would both arrive, he would doubtlessly have arranged matters differently. Soon enough, the arrival of two more legions managed to overcome the Avian resistance, and the Imperial forces cornered the resisting empire on its capital world, Heliosa. The Avenian fought with grim determination, and the battles were fierce. But eventually they were forced back into one last city, Shriek. This city was defended by gigantic fortifications, shielded from orbital bombardment and guarded by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Space Wolves launched assault after assault, but were pushed back each time, taking grievous losses. When the Thousand Sons arrived from the subjugation of another city, they immediately deployed their powers upon Shriek's defenders. Avian soldiers turned on their comrades, while entire sections of the fortification fell apart under the telekinetic grasp of the Raptora cult. The sons of Magnus charged into the openings the psychic assault had created. In a matter of hours, the city had fallen, with the last leader of the Avian Empire either dead or captured. But another battle almost erupted immediately. The Space Wolves felt cheated of their victory by the Thousand Sons, denouncing their use of black magic and Maleficarum. The Thousand Sons replied by calling the Sons of Horus a bunch of ignorant barbarians and hypocrites, pointing at the rune priest standing right among their accusers. Tempers ran hot on both sides, and Magnus and Russ would have come to blows there and then had it not been for the intervention of Lorgar. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers managed to separate his brothers, half by diplomacy and half by swearing that his own warriors would shoot them all if they opened fire. That's pretty cool. Each legion returned to its ships and quickly left the planet, leaving the 17th to take care of the campaign's aftermath, and creating a feud that would only grow worse over the years. When the Orc Empire was shattered at the Battle of Ulanor, the Emperor summoned his sons to witness the triumph that would mark this greatest of victories. Magnus came to congratulate his brothers who had taken part in the battle, but also because he had sensed some new development in the Sea of Souls and wished to talk to his father about it. We do not know what the Emperor Magnus talked about, but when the Master of Mankind announced his decision to withdraw from the Great Crusade and hand over overall command to Horus, he also declared that the Crimson King would accompany him back to Terra to help him in the work ahead. This caused much speculation among the Imperial forces present about the nature of that work, but the Emperor also refused to speak of what he had planned, even to Horus when the newly appointed War Master asked. Magnus selected the elite of his legion to come with him back to Terra. This selection didn't target the most powerful warriors, but the keenest minds, those who would best be able to aid in the Emperor's grand project. The rest of the 15th Legion was placed under command of First Captain Azik Ariman, and seconded to the newly named Sons of Horus, so that the new War Master may rely on their aid in his new duties. Azik Ariman, Keeper of the Lore. A Terran born, Azik Ariman was a psyker of incredible power, possibly the most powerful to have ever lived apart from the Emperor and the Primarchs. Born among the clan of the Achaemenian Empire, He had been part of the very first wave of aspirants to be inducted into the 15th Legion. Alongside his twin brother Ormuzd, they both quickly rose in the ranks, but tragically Ormuzd was lost to the flesh change before the Legion was reunited with Magnus, and the Crimson King put an end to the plague of mutation. According to ancient texts, the death of his brother changed Ahriman, turning him more cold and distant. He dedicated his life to the Legion and became its first captain, as well as the Magister Templi of the Corvide. When Magnus was recalled to Terra by the Emperor, most expected that Ahriman would accompany his Primarch. Instead, Magnus gave his first captain command of the 15th Legion, as well as the Book of Magnus, a grimoire in which the Crimson King had written all the arcane knowledge he had accumulated over the centuries. The Book of Magnus proved instrumental when Ahriman had to lead a circle of librarians from the 15th and 16th Legions during the incidents of the Zenobia Prime to save the soul of Horus Lupercal from the primordial annihilator. On Terra, Magnus was finally revealed the true nature of the dark powers he had sensed in the warps decades before. He learned of chaos and of the Emperor's plan to defeat it once and for all. The Master of Mankind had discovered an ancient webway gate on Terra and sought to master the labyrinthian dimension so that mankind could use it to bypass warp travel entirely. By combining this with the peace that the Imperium would bring to the galaxy, it was his hope that eventually the dark gods would starve and the ancient corruption that the war in the heavens had created would be erased. The Crimson King saw at once the scope of that plan and the titanic efforts that would be required for it to have even the slightest chance of working. At his command, his son began to work alongside the Emperor's savants, bringing their knowledge of the warp to the research. Swift progress was made, but there remained much to do before the Emperor's great work could even begin to be tested. Magnus feared that it would take centuries before the work was complete, and doubted that the Dark Gods would remain silent during that time. Almost unconsciously, he began to devise another, alternative plan, one that was just as titanic in scope, but could be implemented more readily. One day, not long before the Nicaea Council was called, Magnus couldn't keep his silence any longer and presented his plan to his father. Magnus was hoping that mankind could evolve like the Eldar, gaining species-wide psychic powers that could be catalyzed into creating gods inspired by the imperial truth to shelter the Imperium from the depredations of the ruinous powers. With the imperial truth as the basis for morality and the Emperor's guidance, it was his belief that they would avoid the fate of the Eldar. The Emperor chastised his son, remembering him that he had proclaimed at the beginning of the Great Crusade that there would be no gods in the galaxy. Magnus argued that these gods would actually be nothing more than psychic projections, constructs of will and ideals. But the Master of Mankind pointed to those of the Eldar who had not fallen to the darkness, and how they began to worship their own gods, believing in the creation myths that their ancestors had woven out of cloth eons before. Magnus's plan depended on the Emperor being always present to ensure mankind did not follow the same path to decadence as the children of Isha, and that notion was abhorrent to the Emperor. It was his hope, he explained, that one day mankind would no longer need him. Chastised, Magnus returned to his work on the Galactic Network, but his research was soon interrupted when the call came from all Primarchs available to travel to Nicaea, where the question of psychic powers in the Astartes legions would be addressed once and for all. Remembering his recent rebuke, Magnus chose to remain silent during the entirety of the council, leaving others, such as Sperturabo, speak in defense of the Librarius. When the Emperor gave his judgment that the Librarius be maintained as a weapon of war and a way of controlling psychic powers, he was vindicated, yet found himself more worried than joyful. Mortarion was furious, but chose to trust in the Emperor's decision. But Leman Rus was far from being as accepting of the Master of Mankind's decree. The Wolf King publicly denounced the decision as a terrible mistake, and when Magnus tried to talk to his brother to convince him that their father knew what he was doing, the Lord of Fenris struck at the Cyclops. Magnus was so surprised by his brother's aggression that he didn't react to it, and was only saved by the intervention of his equerry, Aemon. The old warrior hurled himself between the two Primarchs and was nearly cut in half by the Wolf King's blow. Rus fled from his crime before he could be stopped by the other Primarchs or the Custodians, while Magnus tended to his fallen mentor, desperately trying to save his life. The final event cast a dark shadow over what would have been a great victory for the Thousand Sons. As Aemon was placed within a dreadnought, Magnus met with his son, Ahriman, telling him to care for Horus during their journey to come, for the Crimson King could sense a great darkness gathering in the Sea of Souls. And after one final meeting, the Primarch went their separate ways, Magnus returning with his father to Terra once more to continue his labor on the great work. At least this time, his old friend Perturabo would come with him. While he couldn't tell him of the Emperor's design yet, Magnus relished the opportunities of more discussions with his brother. Years later, while Perturabo was away dealing with the Xenos attack on Olympia, Horus returned to Terra. Magnus listened to his brother's tale of the Interrex and of the assault Lupercal had suffered. With the Emperor's approval, Magnus told his brother all he knew of Chaos and his demonic servants. At long last, relieving himself from the burden of secrecy. Horus was angry that such an important truth had been concealed from him, and heard that his father had entrusted him with it. But he put aside his feelings and focused on learning all that he could of this new threat. While he was silently proud of Ahriman for succeeding in saving Horus from the Dark God's grasp, Magnus could feel that this was but the first strike of a prolonged conflict. At long last, the ruinous powers had made their move against the Imperium. The warp was roaring, and all members of the reunited 15 Legion could sense the same thing. This was not over. In fact, it was only the beginning. Mere hours after the arrival of Horus, a ship bearing the emblem of the 7th Legion emerged in the Sol system. Commanding it was Captain Alexis Pollux, who described himself as "once of the Imperial Fists." Pollux told Magnus and Horus of their brother's betrayal. Gulliman, Sanguinius, Ferus Manus, and his gene-sire Rogol Dorn had turned against the Emperor and slaughtered those of their sons who would not follow them into rebellion on the fields of Ishvan III. The revelation shook Magnus to his core. Yet even as Horus began to plan the counter-strike to Gulliman's betrayal, seeking to take advantage of the fact that it had been revealed early, the Crimson King felt that this, too, wasn't the end. Not even the true beginning. The burning of Prospero. Even as Horus raced to Terra, filled with new knowledge of the galaxy, the forces of chaos were striking another blow through their unwitting pawns thousands of light years away. Leman Rus had returned from his errands, his mind bent on averting visions of psychic doom for the entire human species. Through extensive research of the logs of the vessels who escaped the route's onslaught, and the testimonies of those who were present, both humans and Astartes, we now have a much clearer knowledge of the proceedings of what would come to be called the burning of Prospero, or the raising, depending on the translation of the original Prosperian term that is being employed. Prospero was defended by several orbital installations, as well as a handful of Legion ships that took turns to scout the system's edge. When the Space Wolves Armada arrived, the one scouting was Talok, the ship of the current commander of the forces present on Prospero, Iskadar Canyon, whose name would come to echo into legend for his defense of the doomed planet and his actions during the rest of the heresy and beyond. Iskadar Canyon, the Black Scourge of Wolves. Born of Prospero, Iskadar was the officer in command of the planets of Dust's defenses when the Space Wolves attacked the world. This rank had been bestowed upon him by Magnus himself after the siege of Olenor, and while Iskadar resented being taken away from the front lines, he soon learned that his Primarch had very good reasons to send him home. On his arrival at Prospero, Canyon learned that his mortal sister, Istara, had fallen victim to some of the few remaining Psychunians. She still lived, but by the time the Chirurgeon servitors had removed the larvae from her brain, almost half of it had been devoured or excised. She had been reduced to an idiotic child, unable even to move. Though he was an Astartes, Canyon still felt as great a connection for his mortal family as any human who had ever lived, something which was regarded as both a blessing and a curse by his battle brothers. He refused to have his sister live that way, and brought her to the tech adepts of the Prosperium Mechanicum outpost. There, she became something more and less than human, the central consciousness of the Anamenis, a construct mind of hundreds of brains linked together and capable of directing the systems of an entire ship. The Anamenis was installed within Canyon's own ship, the Talok, where she acted as the vessel's machine spirit. During the burning, Canyon led from the front, marshalling the defenders of Prospero with all the skill and fury of a son who had seen his parents' home whipped from existence by orbital bombardment. He fought personally against the Rune Priests, confronting 6 of the route's deluded sorceries, and obliterated them in a display of psychic power that scorched his armor black, a color he would keep for the rest of Canyon's lives, bearing it as a symbol of all that had been lost on Prospero. This led to his nickname as Canyon the Black. It is said that Canyon was the first of the heralds of Prospero, these mythical warriors who walked the war with the ghosts of the fallen world alongside them. Accounts from the Roboutian Heresy speak of how during the siege of Terra, he let loose a horde of vengeful spirits upon the traitor's forces, tearing an entire company of Imperial Fists to pieces. Afterwards, during the scouring, he exorcised thousands of Neverborn, banishing them back to the warp with a skill unseen in the rest of the Imperium. These demons remember Canyon well and whisper his name, with whatever passes for fear in their human minds. 100 years after the end of the heresy, when the Thousand Sons and their allies laid siege to the Fang of Fenris, it was Canyon who was granted the honor of leading the charge. After the end of the scouring and the loss of Magnus, Canyon had a violent argument with Ahriman, the reason of which is unknown, and left the Imperium with his old mentor, Ashur Kai, and the Talok, never to be seen again. By using Xenos technology, the Space Wolves were able to hide their approach, both from conventional scanners and from the Thousand Sons' psychic senses. Only when they were in range of the orbital defenses they revealed themselves, unleashing a deluge of assault crafts on the space stations, and reducing the few ships to scrap through the overwhelming force. In short order, the Space Wolves were masters of Prospero's orbital space. The raising could begin. Fire rained from the skies as the Sons of Fenris bombarded every city of Prospero, seeking to wipe out as much of its population as possible. Of all the Prosperian cities, only Zika, the City of Light, had any protection from orbital assault, and when its mighty void shields were soon breached by the combined might of the 6th Legion's fleet, ancient libraries and pyramids were annihilated, while the Thousand Sons deployed their psychic might to shield as much of their own fortifications as possible, and hurried the terrified citizens of Zika into a dubious shelter they provided. In the heart of Zika stood Captain Canyon, his mind burning with rage and sorrow in equal measure. The son of Magnus had just witnessed the house of his mortal parents explode and sensed the terrified final moments of his kin. When the Space Wolves landed outside the ruins of Zika, outside the ruins that Zika had become, Canyon reached out to those of his brothers who had survived the initial bombardment. There were several hundreds of them, arrayed against the thousands of wolves coming upon them. Even with the help of the spear guard, who had managed to gather in order of battle despite the utter chaos, this wouldn't be enough. But Canyon had a plan. Mind-linked with his battle brothers, Canyon sent his mind to the desert surrounding Zika, searching for the primitive minds of the beasts that had devoured his sister's brain. Using ancient words of power that had first been pronounced in the era when the Prosperian had thought to fight the predators of their world rather than flee from them, Canyon summoned the Psychinians to the battle. From 1,000 nests they came, charging the space wolves in their urge to reach the source of their psychic call. Almost every Psychinian still alive on Prospero had, over the course of decades, migrated to the surroundings of Zika, drawn to its bounty of psychic souls like a moth to the flame. The warp-born predators fell upon the route like a cataclysm from ancient myths, driven mad by Canyon's spell. They pulsed their larvae into all the sons of Rus in equal measures, for all of them bore a shard of their so-called word. The power they insisted came from the spirits of Fenris. From 1,000 nests they came, charging the space wolves in their urge to reach the source of the psychic call. Almost every Psychinian still alive on Prospero had why am I reading this again? Anyway, hundreds of wolves died that way, thrashing around as their brains were being eaten from the inside. But soon the 6th Legion destroyed the Psychinion and resumed its advance on Zika, determined to punish the 1,000 Suns for what they saw as another display of fell sorcery. Ultimate proof, though they did not need it, of Prospero's corruption. They reached the destroyed hab blocks and ran through paved streets, marching straight towards the city center, where remained the last standing pyramids. Many and terrible are the tales of the heroes of Prospero. Anku Anin, guardian of the Great Library, who fought and slew 60 space wolves before being felled by the rune priest Otter Weirdmake. Auramaga, who turned himself into a fiery meteor as he charged through the ranks of the wolves, hoping to immolate Leman Rus alongside himself. Kalopsis, who gave his life so that the ancient warlord titan Canis Vertex would wreak destruction upon the 16th Legion. But also Ecos Pereon, sergeant of the Spire Guard, who killed a rune priest with a knife wrought from the bone of one of Prospero's ancient philosophers. Humans and transhumans alike died well that day, spitting their defiance in the wolf's face with their last breath. Yet all the bravery in the galaxy could not overcome such numbers as the 1,000 Suns and their allies faced. And, soon, they were cornered with the last and greatest of Zika's pyramids, the Pyramid of Hotep. There the sons of Magnus prepared to make their last stand, but Canyon refused to let this be the end. Thousands of civilians had taken refuge within the structure. Thousands were the last of Prospero's people. He would not let them perish, not if there was any way to save them. At the very moment of the battle beginning, Canyon had reached out to his old mentor, Ashur Kai Querzevach, who he had departed Prospero with his ship, the Talok, to patrol the system's edge. Canyon ordered Ashur Kai to remain safely away from the 6th Legion Armada, hiding beneath one of Prospero's gas giants. But now, as the wolves gathered for the final assault, Canyon needed a Talok to risk destruction if there was any chance to salvage anything from the ruination of Prospero. It was very likely that the ship would manage to get close enough for Canyon to undertake his last, desperate gamble before the wolves overwhelmed the Pyramid of Hotep. Yet, after all the slaughter they had wrought, the warriors of Fenris seemed unwilling to push their advance. They surrounded the pyramid, but didn't push any further. It only took a few moments for the 1,000 Suns to sense what their enemies were planning. In another part of the city, on the ruins of what had been Magnus's own tower, the rune priests had gathered. Great and terrible energies were whirling around them, and 15,000 Suns had been crucified in a circle, their power neutralized by Xenos drugs. Canyon watched from afar, and soon a horrible realization dawned upon him. The wolves didn't simply intend to murder Prospero. Whether the rest of the 16th Legion knew it or not, The Rune Priest had started a ritual that would channel warp energies generated by the world's death and use them to perform a death curse upon every son of Magnus, even on the Primarch himself. The sheer hubris of such a ritual, the arrogance of self-proclaimed executioners of the Emperor, almost made Canyon physically sick. It was only because of the dark rumors about the Space Wolves' past that he even entertained the notion that was the barbarians were attempting was possible. But if he could interrupt the ritual, Canyon could still hope to disturb it. The reason for the Space Wolves' delayed assault was now clear. They were waiting for the Rune Priest's signal, so that the death of the final sons of Magnus would coincide with their ritual's climax. The captain's desperate plan had suddenly become much less of a forlorn hope. And indeed, when the Space Wolves finally launched their assault under the psychic choir of 15,000 sons, undergoing barbaric tortures, the Talok had reached its position just beyond the reach of the 16th Legion's armada. Channeling all its powers, Canyon used his mental link to his old teacher Ashur-Kai to open a portal through the warp leading from the pyramid to the vessel, while a group of legionnaires and spire guards led the rearguard action to hold back the horde. The surviving people of Prospero poured through the gateway, carrying with them a fraction of the lore of the thousand sons had accumulated on Prospero. Soon, Canyon stood alone before the passage. But before he could pass through, a space wolf called to him. The warrior of the rout had become separated from his pack when roaming through the labyrinthine pyramid of Photep. He now saw an enemy sorcerer and arrogantly demanded that his foe face him in battle, proclaiming his name as Arak, born of fire, champion of the 16th Legion, agent of Russ's rightful retribution upon this sinful world. Rage. It burned through Canyon's blood like acid. Despite all his control and all the enumerations, from the moment he had sensed the first deaths in orbit, rage had been in his thoughts. As he watched Zika burn, as he felt each death through his sixth sense, that rage had grown. Even as he led the resistance and planned the survivors' escape, that rage had occupied his thoughts. It would not leave him, and he would not have it any other way. As the wolf's challenge rang across the underground room, Canyon knew that the smart thing to do was to cross the portal. What did the warrior behind him matter? He was but one killer among a legion of traitors. Could his life balance the billions that had died on this world? Could his death pay for the civilization the rout had destroyed? Canyon had a duty to bring the survivors to Terra, to warn Magnus and the Emperor of the 16th's treachery. His master, his sister, they awaited on Talok, and he knew they wouldn't run until he was aboard. Delaying here would endanger all those he had fought to save. Slowly, his mind torn between two imperatives, Canyon turned and saw his challenger with his mortal eyes. Arak, born of fire, was tall and proud, with the handsome face of a barbarian king. While Canyon's armor was charred black, the wolf's was in mint condition and covered in runes of warding that made Canyon's mind ache. In his hand, the champion held a power axe, beautifully carved so that the blade looked like a howling wolf. The weapon's runic name was inscribed upon the blade: Cyan, Truth, in one of the many Fenrisian dialects. The rage grew cold. The chorus of angry voices at the back of his mind suddenly went silent. He thought of Talok and found that he didn't care anymore. When revenge is all that is left to you, you take it no matter the cost. "Begone," spoke Isidar Canyon. And with that simple word, his will was done. The Horus Heresy, the war beneath the throne. Hell is empty, and all the devils are here. Fragment of an old Earth manuscript, estimated the 2nd millennium. Hey, nice, it's our time. I just have to find it. With the arrival of Canyon's shattered companies and Horus's return to Terra, all the 1,000 suns were now gathered on the throne world, save for a few who had been sent on missions of their own across the galaxy by the Great Crusade's demands. Together, they began to work on reinforcing the defenses built by the Iron Warriors, casting powerful wards that would keep the influence of the ruinous powers at bay, many of which still stand to this day. Yet, their Primarch was among them. Just as Canyon crossed the portal, the axe of his dead enemy in hand, the Rune Priest ritual had reached its end. The power of the warp poured through them, and the terrible psychic blow left Prospero, coursing through the sea of souls at the speed of thought. Though the ritual had fallen to reach its intended power, it was still mighty indeed, and might have slain Magnus outright had it struck him directly. But Magnus had been in the throne room when Prospero had fallen, working on the Emperor's great device. The blow hit the wards placed upon the webway gate with a force worthy of gods and shattered them, exhausting all of its energy in the process. Their path unbarred, the millions demons that had waited on the other side poured through. At once the Emperor, Magnus, and the Custodians had begun a fight that would last the entirety of the heresy. Horus and Perturabo were left in charge of the defenses of Terra, while Ahriman directed the efforts of the Thousand Sons. As the Emperor and the Crimson King battled underground, some lesser creatures of the warp also found their way through the damaged wards of Terra, and no longer forced back by the Emperor's psychic aura, for he was wholly focused on preventing the greater incursion. The Sons of Magnus walked the hive cities of the throne world, finding rogue psychers, mutants, and the secret worshippers of the ruinous powers, who, for the first time in more than 200 years, suddenly found their prayers answered once more. Several times the Thousand Sons battled against demon hosts, protecting the people of Terra from threats that they had long believed to be no more than ancient myths. And I lost the wording. Amidst and secret worshippers of the ruinous powers, who, for the first time in more than... Several times the Thousand Sons battled against demon hosts, protecting the people of Terra from threats that they had long believed to be more than ancient myths. Despite the Sons of Magnus' best efforts to hide the truth, rumor soon began to spread, and turn into 100 legends that persist to this day, of beasts of darkness and the Crimson Warriors who battled them during the darkest of days. The years of the Roboutian Heresy passed, with the arch-traitor drawing ever closer. During these days, amidst the endless tide of demons that he fought side by side with his father, Magnus received a terrible vision. Intended as a taunt from the dark god Zinch, the Crimson King saw what had become of his brother, Lionel Johnson, and wept at the fate of the Night Lord of Caliban. Taking a short time away from the fight, Magnus sent a message through the warp to Luther, who even now awaited his liege's return on Caliban, unaware of his treachery. This warning would prove instrumental in denying the traitor legions a considerable asset, though it would cost many loyal lives and the First Legion's homeworld. Finally, the traitor legions and their allies, both mortal and demonic, reached the Sol System, and the final battle of the heresy began in earnest. After Guilliman's armies had breached through the orbital defenses of Terra, the forces of chaos flooded the planet, and the Thousand Sons stood upon the walls of the Imperial Palace. And at their side were the Sons of Horus, the Iron Warriors, and the Death Guard. Together they wreaked terrible destruction upon the enemies of the Imperium. Then, the Dark Angel sorcerers gathered in dread circles of their own, and cast evil spells upon the defenders of the Imperial Palace. Entire companies of Astartes were lost to the grotesque mutations and warp fire, and the Thousand Sons were forced to withdraw many of their librarians from the walls so that they could focus their minds on countering the sorcery of the First Legion. Only those of the Sons of Magnus with little psychic power or an inability to mind link remained on the walls. Among them was Amon, the former equerry of Magnus, who had neared death at the Wolf King's hands, but had been reborn in the form of a dreadnought. Amon, equerry of Magnus. In his youth, Amon was hunted by dreams of Zika in flames. Only when Magnus arrived on Prospero did the nightmares abate, and Aemon believed that the Crimson King's presence had somehow averted this terrible vision. When the Emperor came to Prospero, Aemon was a grown man, far too old to become a space marine. At Magnus's demands, he became one of the so-called Falx Astartes, akin to Luther of the Dark Angels. He was given the extensive genetic modification and access to the best equipment the Imperium could provide. Combined with his precognitive abilities, this made him more than able to fight alongside the rest of the 15 Legion, becoming the Magister Templi of the Corvide. For many years, he led this section of the Thousand Sons to war, before leaving command to Azek Ahriman and becoming the Primarch's equerry. After his wounds at the hand of Leman Rus at the Council of Nicaea, Aemon was healed by his Primarch, but the power of the Cyclops, diminished by the constant warding of his sons' souls, was not enough to fully repair the damage wrought by the Wolf King's fury, and Aemon had to be interred in a dreadnought. He returned with his father to Terra, where he lent his wisdom to his brethren in between his moments of rest. When Canyon returned with the news of Prospero's fate, Aemon found his youthful vision had come true, and vowed revenge on the Scions of Chaos. Disregarding slumber from that point on, he fought during the heresy to help keep Terra safe, and faced the traitor legions on the walls of the Imperial Palace during the siege. There, he slew many traitors before being finally killed by Ferus Manus when attempting to enter the Cavea Ferum in the last hours of the heresy. For days, the Thousand Sons psychically battled the Dark Angels under the direction of their first captain Ahriman. The fifth week of the siege. I guess it's on the fifth week of the siege. However, the walls of the palace were breached by a band of the 6th Legion, led by Rune Priest Ottere Weirdmake and the champion Bjorn Fellhand. Ahriman dueled with the Rune Priest and destroyed his opponent's mind by revealing to him the truth of what he and his legion had become. Murderers of innocents who had justified their paranoia with self-delusion and false righteousness born of fear and bloodthirst. Weird's very soul was destroyed by the powers of the first captain. Yet Ahriman would have died at Bjorn's claw had it not been for the intervention of Lucius the Reborn. Good one. The undying warrior of the Emperor's children stopped the Space Wolf champion, and his mere presence forced the wolves into a retreat. Yet the damage had been done. For a moment, the circle of the Thousand Sons had been disturbed, and the Dark Angels had capitalized on the opportunity their allies of the 6th Legion had brought them. Ahriman had used all of his power and will to prevent the entire outer wall from collapsing under the psychic assault, and the strain was such that Phoisis Takar, Magister Templi of the Raptora cult, burned himself to a husk to repel the advantage the false sorcerers had gained. Mere hours after Phosis' death, Horus and Sanguinius dueled at the Eternity Gate, and the War Master fell under the fangs of the fallen angel. The Primarch of the 9th Legion was reborn as an avatar of the Dark Prince, Slanesh, and the Blood Angels finally focused their attention on the palace instead of the Terran population. Only the arrival of the Night Lords and the Emperor's children, emerging from their own path through the webway, prevented the traitor legions from overwhelming the walls. When the Mournival destroyed Sanguinius' physical incarnation, the tide clearly turned against the traitors for the first time since they had landed on Terra. They could still win, for they held the superior numbers, even with the Blood Angels incapacitated by Sanguinius' fall. But the warp was rolling with the coming of the 12th and 17th Legions, returning from the Runestorm with vengeance in their hearts. When they arrive, there will be no more hope of victory for the traitor armada. His back to the wall, Guilliman was forced to gamble everything on one last stratagem. The arch-traitor himself led one massive assault on the gates of the Imperial Palace, accompanied by 3 of his brothers. The wards the Thousand Sons had raised and the walls the Iron Warriors had built were equally shattered by the advance of the 4 traitor Primarchs, while the loyal Space Marines who stood against them were obliterated, barely slowing their advance. 3 traitor Primarchs entered the Cavea Ferrum: Robut Gulliman, Rogo Dorn, and Lionel Johnson. One of the three, only L. Johnson had shed his mortality to become an immortal prince of the warp, but he was far from being at his peak strength. At Caliban, his battle against his foster father Luther had ended badly for the Lion, for though he had been victorious, his chest bled forever from a wound that was as physical as it was metaphorical. Yet still, as the demon prince of Tzeentch, his sorcerer's power was considerable, and should he fight the Emperor alongside Gulliman, then the master of mankind couldn't hope to prevail. So it was that Magnus deployed his powers across the labyrinth, combining his psychic abilities with the non-Euclidean geometries of Perturabo's construction to separate each of the traitor Primarchs and direct them to their own individual battles. While Perturabo faced his old rival Dorn, and the Emperor fought against the arch-traitor, it fell to Magnus to banish the fallen master of the First Legion. Meanwhile, the Emperor's greatest and most devoted servant, Malcador the Sigillite, sat upon the golden throne, keeping the demonic hordes at bay through sheer psychic power. The duel between Magnus and Lionel Johnson was sorcerous as well as physical. The Crimson King was exhausted by the years of endless battle against the demonic legions, but the Demon Primarch was also severely weakened by the wound Luther had dealt him. In the end, thanks to the old knight's dying gift, Magnus was able to unravel the threads that linked Lionel Johnson to the mortal plane and cast his shrieking spirit into the ether, to the foot of the great deceiver's throne. The duel between After his victory, Magnus sensed an event of monumentous importance taking place in the center of the Cavea Ferrum, right where it had been planned for the Emperor to confront Gulliman. He knew that Gulliman had fallen, and felt the traitors run from the throne world. But he also sensed something else. Rushing through the twisted corridors, Magnus beheld a vision of absolute despair. His father was dying, a scarred and grim revenant that the Crimson King only barely recognized, as Fulgrim stood guard over him. Beyond them, Malcador was gone from the golden throne. Nothing but a pile of ash remaining of the first Lord of Terra. Already the demonic hordes, temporarily cast back by the defeat of their champion Gulliman, were gathering anew. With no time to find another way, Magnus dragged his father's body towards the throne, while Perturabo, newly arrived at the scene of devastation, worked the ancient's mechanisms. Never before had the Iron Lord laid eyes upon the wondrous machine, yet he understood its workings at a glance, and together with the Cyclops and his brother, put the Emperor upon the golden throne, activating the stasis field and other preservation devices that would keep him alive forevermore and enable him to hold back the tide of chaos. But the heresy was over. The Emperor was lost to mankind, and with him, so was lost his dream of humanity free from the warp, and his plan to make the glorious vision a reality. Post-heresy, the war of fate. My sons cry out for vengeance and seek the blood of the wolves. They speak of Fenris and crave his destruction. Their nights are haunted with the screams of our murdered world, and they know no peace. In time I shall lead them there. There is much more important work to do first. My brothers have broken the galaxy apart, sundering the veil, and the foulness of the warp seeps into reality through 1,000 wounds. All must be found, and all must be closed. That is my task, and as long as it is not complete, I cannot allow my sons justice, nor myself the luxury of grief, for all that is shall become tainted by the ruinous powers. But I fear the cost to my sons. Of all of them, it is for Iskadar that I fear the most. His rage has darkened his thoughts, and the hatred he feels for us grows with each passing week. He recognizes this and tries to contain it with meditation, but it is not enough. His dreams are hunted by wolves, and they press on the minds of those nearby. He thirsts for the death of the 6th Legion and all traitors with them. It hurts to see him like this, and yet I cannot help but think that perhaps this hatred makes him better suited to the new galaxy than any other of my sons, who all for their desires of justice are still consumed by sorrow. For as I peer into the future, I see only darkness and war unending. From the writings of Primarch Magnus after the siege of Terra. Although the traitor legions had been broken at Terra, the powers they had unleashed upon the galaxy during the heresy cared little for the fall of Guilliman. Dozens of warp rifts had been opened, either deliberately or as a result of planet-wide carnages, and demonic incursions raged unchecked on hundreds of worlds. Greatest of these wounds in reality was the Rift of Pandorax, where the Iron Hands had first been dragged into damnation by the schemes of Nurgle, Chaos God of Decay. On the cursed demon world of Pythos was a tear in the fabric of the universe through which thousands of demons passed daily, forming a host that could very well grow until it would threaten the recovering Imperium itself. Even from Terra, Magnus could feel the taint of the rift and the threat it represented. While other legions hunted the traitors across the galaxy, Magnus gathered what resources he could to attack Pythos and close the rift. He found an unlikely ally in the person of his brother Mortarion, who knew also very well the danger possessed by the demonic portal. Together, the two Primarchs were able to draw far more military forces to their cause, and came to the Pandorax system with an armada worthy of the Great Crusade. Yet despite all that might, the Battle of Pythos was to see the fall of Mortarion, under the claws of Demon Primarch Vulcan, returned triumphant from the War of the Dragon. At the other side of the galaxy, enraged by his brother's death, but determined to finish what they had started, Magnus managed to seal the Pythos gateway into the warp, banishing the remaining demonic hosts. Hundreds of thousand suns worked together to create the words of the damnation cache over the location of the rift, to make sure that it would never be opened again. After the Battle of Pythos, the scouring continued for the Thousand Suns. Scattered across the stars, they fought to seal the other rifts open during the heresy, until the time that Magnus decreed that their task was complete. By that point, more than a century had passed, and the Thousand Suns still hungered for revenge. It was time, declared the Crimson King. At long last, the 15th Legion will bring just retribution upon the treacherous Space Wolves. The time had come for them to go to Fenris. The Battle of the Fang remained in the annals of the Thousand Suns as a great victory, as it did in those of their allies, the Sons of Horus and the Imperial regiments who were present. But in truth, it was a bitter victory that came at a great cost, and did not prove to be the final destruction of the Space Wolves that the Sons of Magnus had hoped for. With the intervention of Bjorn Fellhand at the last moment, many warriors of Vulca Fenrica escaped. Fenris itself, however, was destroyed even more completely than Prospero had been, ripped apart by its own inner energies and the warp storms unleashed by the Fellhand's final, spiteful act of firing on the Fang with his ships. In time, the Battle of the Fang would prove to be no more than another event in the long series of battles the 15th and the 6th Legions would wage against each other over the millennia. This long-standing hatred would erupt once more 1,000 years later, and end up costing much more to the Thousand Suns than they were prepared to give. In the 274 year of the 32nd millennium, why did he write it like that? Whatever. A Black Crusade was declared against the Prosperian domain by the Chaos Lord Ver Greylock. Once, Greylock had been the commander of the 12th Great Company, but his hold over his men had weakened since the Battle of the Fang, and his great company had fractured in several war bands. Yet Greylock had not let this discourage him, and he had spent 10 centuries plotting, gathering allies, and striking infernal bargains, all in the name of vengeance, and of finishing what the Space Wolves had started at Prospero. Greylock's Black Crusade sought to purge the entire Dominion from human life, to destroy the Thousand Suns fortress, and slay the Crimson King. Ultimately, Greylock was defeated and slain by First Captain Ahriman, but during the final battle of the Black Crusade, the Legion's flagship, the Photep, was boarded while Magnus was on board. Leading the boarders was one of the Chaos Lord's allies, a powerful Lord of Change who confronted Magnus and cast a powerful curse upon the Primarch before withdrawing and abandoning the Dark Angel's contingents that had accompanied it aboard the vessel. The curse expelled Magnus' spirit from his body and into the warp, where it remains to this day, engaged in an eternal conflict against the servants of Tzeentch. The Thousand Suns evacuated their Primarch's body from the ship just before the Dark Angels sabotaged its warp drive, causing it to detonate. It is unknown whether the Sons of the Lion knew that they were going to their doom when they boarded the Photep. Doubtlessly, they sought to avenge their Primarch's defeat during the siege, perhaps not caring for the cost to themselves. I see it. My sons, I see it. I see the Emperor's light, returning to the galaxy in its darkest hour. I see the fire of hope kindled anew, and the broken dreams reforged in the fires of war. Magnus' last words before succumbing to the curse and falling into a coma. The Thousand Suns have vowed to find the demon responsible and extract from it the truth of the Primarch's fate, and how to remedy it. Over the centuries, this quest has been unsuccessful, but the Sons of Magnus have learned much about the Lord of Change, including the name it uses the most, Zahariel the Everwatcher, one of the most powerful greater demons of Tzeentch. They have clashed with the creature several times, but so far, Zahariel has always managed to either slay all its enemies or escape. Soon after Magnus' spirit was lost to the verges of the warp, the Thousand Suns began to suffer from a legion-wide plague of mutations that immediately brought to the minds of the veterans the horrors they had endured before their Primarch was found. The flesh change kept at bay by Magnus for hundreds of years had returned. The new Legion Master Ahriman threw himself into the search for a cure, studying his father's notes in the Book of Magnus, seeking to replicate the Primarch's feat. After years of research, during which the numbers of the 15 Legion continued to decrease increasingly quickly, he believed that he had found a way. Ahriman called for a gathering of the entire Legion on an uninhabited world within the Prosperian domain. There, together with several dozens of librarians, he cast a spell called the Rubric that he hoped would recreate the psychic warding Magnus had once raised around his sons. None but the Thousand Suns were present on that nameless world, and they never spoke of what exactly happened after the ritual was cast. But where thousands of legionnaires had gathered, barely more than 1,000 remained. These warriors were free of the flesh change, but according to them, all the others, those whose psychic strength had been too weak to endure the Rubik's power, were dead. Ever since that day, the recruitment of new Thousand Suns had slowed to a crawl when compared to other legions, despite the 15 Legion having access to the Primarch's body and a great number of worlds from which to claim aspirants. Their numbers have slowly eroded over the millennia, and many Chaos Lords and other heretics have claimed that their extinction is but a matter of time. Soon after Rubik was cast, Ahriman disappeared, leaving the Thousand Suns leaderless. There are many claims that the former Legion Master wanders the webway, though what his purpose is varies according to rumors. Some pretend that he seeks one of the missing Primarchs, others that he is looking for a way to return his father's spirit to his body. Yet more that whatever his reason for entering the webway, he is now running for his soul from a host of demons. Most, though, especially among the Thousand Suns themselves, believe that he searches for a way to perfect the Rubik. He marched in darkness, his path light only by the points of light that seemed at once infinitely far and within his hand's reach. Corridors left the path he walked, some of them leading to blackness similar to the one he now crossed. others leading to openings to worlds he did not know. He felt the temptation to just cross any of the openings, to return to the material realm, but he continued walking. This was his penitence and his absolution. His hands were red with his legion's blood, and he would make things right. Perhaps it was his pride speaking, the same pride that had led him to believe he could emulate his father's work. Perhaps it was desperation, the urge to flee from his crime rather than face it. In the end, it did not matter. The exile kept walking, letting his mind follow the impossibly alien designs of the labyrinth, searching for its center. He was chasing a myth, and he knew it. Even those whose skin controlled it regarded it as more than an ancient legend. But the exile had seen the myths before. He had been part of legends, witnessed and shaped history. This myth, the story of the Black Library, was the only hope he had. And so he walked uncaring of how many centuries it would take. Motion before him drew his attention away from his half-conscious reverie, and he raised his staff before him, ready to defend himself. Many times already he had been attacked by beasts seeking to feast on his body, and by creatures sent by the enemies of his legion. But this newcomer was neither of these things. It was a silhouette of shadows, wearing a mask that was at once beautiful and terrifying on some primal level of the exile's soul. The silhouette motioned with one finger for the exile to follow, and walked into another corridor of the webway. Ahriman followed. With the slow diminishing of the 15 Legion and their protection of psychers and other individuals connected to the warp, the Imperium slowly became more intolerant of the warp touched. Fear and hatred of the mutant grew, and the Sisters of Silence, already decimated during the Siege of Terra, suffered for it, with the recruitment of pariah becoming more and more difficult, and the Lords of Terra's repeated moves against them in order to gain political clout. The Order became a shadow of what it once was. Today, the Sisters of Silence still exist, but they are reduced to a handful of monasteries scattered across the Imperium, where they keep away from prying eyes. The Inquisition, especially the Ordo Malus, protects these last outposts, for the Sisters of Silence are often a useful tool for the Inquisitors, in their endless battles against the demons. Also, following the 15th Legion's weakening, ignorance and superstition have also been on the rise. The Inquisition's constant and ruthless suppression of all knowledge of the demonic, combined with the Thousand Sons no longer being able to keep all of their records alive in memory, has caused the Imperium's collective knowledge of the great enemy to fade. In the latest centuries, many Inquisitors have recognized the threat this possesses, but all who have tried to do something about it have ended up walking the path of the radical, corrupted by the knowledge they managed to acquire, and were hunted down by their colleagues, only reinforcing the Inquisition's beliefs in the suppression of such knowledge in the vicious circle. Worst of all, perhaps, the doubt of the Thousand Sons is how the distrust of the Psychers is slowly spread to other loyal legions. After all, recruits are taken from human worlds, and all the psycho conditioning they go through does not fully erase the beliefs they had when they were mere mortals. Over the years, the 15th Legion has grown more and more isolated, for while the librarians of other legions can at least claim the connection of blood with their doubting brethren, the Thousand Sons are further removed. For now, this had no other consequences than the Sons of Magnus suffering from isolation, but the potential for some catastrophic misunderstanding remains. And while the Imperium grows weaker with every passing millennium, more and more threats continue to appear. During the 31st millennium, the seers of the Corvide foretold of a great power rising throughout the galaxy, awakening from an eon-long slumber. Soon, after this wave of visions, entire Imperial worlds all across the galaxy suddenly fell silent, without so much as a single astropathic cry for help. The Thousand Sons have marshaled in strength unseen for thousands of years in order to investigate this new threat to mankind's rightful domain over the stars, accompanied by the agents of all three Ordos and contingencies of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Thousand Sons and the Grey Knights. At first glance, the 15 legions and the Sons of Titan might appear very similar. Both are a group of psychic Astartes. Their numbers are roughly equal, and many of the first Grey Knights chosen by Malcador the Sigillite were taken from the ranks of the 15 Legion. However, there are many key differences between the two. While the Grey Knights aspirants are entirely remade during their ascension, their past identity literally destroyed and wiped out. The Thousand Sons are far less intensive in their training. A son of Magnus is a teacher, and needs to keep an open, if well-defended mind. And while the Grey Knights are unleashed against demonic threats when they become the only option, the Thousand Sons wage the war of fate on the Imperium's behest continuously. Their seers battle the Dark Angel's oracles, the Eldar's Farseers, and other kinds of prophets that would see their abilities against mankind. They are not beholden to the Inquisition, but fight the wars that need to be fought, not for the present of the Imperium, but for its future. As for the other Thousand Sons, they fight alongside the Imperial armies without keeping their existence a secret. The coming of the 15 Legion is a source of both relief and dread, for while their power is great, their arrival indicates that the situation is dire. Meanwhile, the Grey Knights' very existence is kept a secret from the Imperial population, and the Imperium's enemies alike, meaning that those who fight at their side and witness their prowess are usually purged at the battle's end, often by the very hands of those champions who delivered them from the demonic host and its threat.